Okay, so picture this. My brother David inherited a multi-million-dollar empire from our dad, a sprawling business conglomerate worth an estimated $41 million, cash, assets, everything. And me, I got a dilapidated old boat. Not a yacht, not a fancy cruiser, just a rusty barnacle, encrusted fishing boat that probably hadn't seen open water in 2 decades. It was insulting, to say the least. David, with his slick suits and even slicker smile, now lorded over boardrooms and private jets, while I was left staring at a glorified bathtub with an outboard motor that probably didn't work. The will reading was a farce, a carefully orchestrated humiliation designed, I was sure, by my father from beyond the grave. And honestly, it left me wondering, was I wrong for feeling so incredibly bitter? Tell me, if you were in my shoes, would you have felt the same gut-wrenching unfairness? Let me take you back to the beginning, before the will, before the boat, before all the resentment curdled in my stomach. My father, Richard Sterling, was a titan of industry. He built his empire from nothing, starting with a single, small manufacturing plant and growing it into a global powerhouse. He was a driven, brilliant, but ultimately distant man. Work was his life, and David, his firstborn, was his golden boy. David was groomed from an early age to take over. He went to the best schools, interned at the company every summer, and excelled at everything he touched. He had the sharp business acumen, the charm, the ruthless ambition that my father admired. I, on the other hand, was the quieter one, the artistic one, the one who preferred spending my weekends tinkering with engines in the garage or sketching in a notebook rather than poring over market reports. I loved my father, of course, but our relationship was always strained, overshadowed by David's brilliance and my father's constant, subtle disappointment in my lack of drive. For the family business, he'd often say, "You need to think bigger, son. This world doesn't wait for dreamers." I tried, truly I did, to show interest. I even took a few business courses in college, but my heart just wasn't in it. I found joy in the tangible, in fixing things with my hands, in the simple satisfaction of a perfectly tuned engine. While David was strategizing mergers, I was restoring a classic motorcycle in my spare time. Our mother, God rest her soul, was the only one who truly understood me, who encouraged my passions. She passed away when I was in my early 20s, leaving me feeling even more isolated within the family. Years went by, and my father's health began to decline. It was a slow, agonizing process, marked by hospital visits and hushed conversations with doctors. David was by his side constantly, acting as the dutiful son, already seamlessly stepping into the role of future CEO. I visited too, of course, but our conversations were always superficial, never delving into anything meaningful. It was clear our father-son bond, if it ever truly existed beyond a paternal obligation, had withered. When he finally passed, it was a profound sadness, even with all our distance. He was my father, after all. The funeral was a grand affair, attended by dignitaries and business associates from around the world, a testament to the empire he had built. During the reception, David was already networking, shaking hands, receiving condolences with a practiced grace that solidified his image as the rightful successor. I felt like an outsider looking in, a forgotten footnote in the grand narrative of the Sterling dynasty. Then came the will reading a week later. The family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, a stoic man with a permanent frown etched on his face, gathered David and me in his opulent office. David sat across from me, a smug, almost pitying look on his face. He knew what was coming. I had a sinking feeling in my gut, a premonition of what was to be revealed. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and began to read, his voice droning on about stocks, bonds, properties, and the vast fortune that was being bequeathed. He listed off numerous charitable donations, substantial gifts to distant relatives, and even a trust for our father's loyal long-time executive assistant. Finally, he got to us. To my eldest son, David Sterling, I leave the entirety of the Sterling Group of companies, including all subsidiaries, assets, and intellectual property. It is my belief that David has demonstrated the leadership, vision, and dedication required to continue and expand the legacy I have built. David barely suppressed a triumphant smirk. He'd won, he had everything. Then came my turn. I braced myself, and to my son, Michael Sterling, Mr. Henderson continued, his voice devoid of emotion, I leave my personal fishing boat, the Seafarer, currently docked at the old marina, along with a stipend of $10,000 for its upkeep. A fishing boat, a measly $10,000. David let out a small, almost imperceptible chuckle. The blood rushed to my ears. It was a slap in the face, a public declaration of my worthlessness in my father's eyes. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but I held it in, the anger burning a hole in my stomach. I simply stood up, nodded curtly to Mr. Henderson, and walked out, leaving David still basking in his glorious inheritance. The sting of that moment, the raw humiliation, was something I knew I'd never forget. For weeks, I stewed in my anger and resentment. David called me once, feigning sympathy, telling me he was sorry Dad hadn't seen my potential in the business. It was condescending and infuriating. I told him to go to hell. I wanted nothing to do with him or his new empire. The boat sat in the back of my mind, a symbol of everything I wasn't. Finally, curiosity, or perhaps a morbid fascination, got the better of me. I drove down to the old marina, a derelict place mostly abandoned, to see the Seafarer. It was worse than I imagined. Rust bloomed on its hull like a disease, the paint was peeling, and the cabin windows were opaque with grime. It was a wreck, a true monument to neglect. The inside was no better. Cobwebs draped every surface. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and stagnant water. It was a ghost ship. I spent the next few days clearing it out, mostly to spite David and my father. I figured I'd sell it for scrap, get what little I could, and use the $10,000 to move on with my life. As I was pulling out old fishing nets and rusty tools from the small storage compartment in the hull, my hand brushed against something metallic embedded in the wood. It was an odd shape, not part of the boat's original structure. I grabbed a flashlight and peered closer. There, bolted to the inner frame of the hull, was a small, ornate wooden box, intricately carved with what looked like an old family crest. It was hidden, deliberately obscured by a false panel that blended seamlessly with the hull. My heart started to pound. This wasn't just a random box. This was deliberately concealed. I spent the next hour carefully prying open the panel. It was secured with small, almost invisible screws, obviously designed to evade detection. When I finally got it open, the box was revealed. It wasn't locked, but it was heavy. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, and a tarnished silver key. The journal looked like it had been handled extensively, its cover worn smooth in places. I picked it up, feeling a strange connection to it, a sense of anticipation. This wasn't some old fishing log. This was something personal. I opened it to the first page. It was my father's handwriting, unmistakable, bold, and precise. The first entry was dated nearly 40 years ago, around the time David was born. So that's the situation I was in, alone in that rusty old boat, holding a secret box and a journal that suddenly felt more valuable than any multi-million-dollar corporation. I had to make a choice. Before I tell you what happened next, what I discovered in those pages, and what it meant for my father's empire and my relationship with David, I want you to pause right now and comment below. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have assumed it was just old junk? Or would your gut have told you there was something more? What would be your wildest guess about what was hidden inside that journal? I sat down on the grimy floor of the boat, the journal open in my hands, completely captivated. The first few entries were mundane, detailing my father's early struggles building his business, the sacrifices he made, the long hours. But then the tone shifted. He started writing about a secret, a profound mistake he had made early in his career, a deal that was not just unethical, but outright illegal. He detailed how he had systematically sabotaged a rival company, stealing their intellectual property and driving them into bankruptcy, all to secure his own foothold in the market. He meticulously documented the names, dates, and specific actions, providing irrefutable proof of his crimes. He wrote about the guilt that plagued him, the sleepless nights, the fear of exposure, but he never confessed, never made amends. He just kept building, layer upon layer, on a foundation of deceit. My hands started to shake. This wasn't just a confession. It was a blueprint for a corporate scandal that would rock the entire industry. But then, as I delved deeper, the story took an even darker turn. He wrote about the pressure, the constant fear of being caught. And he wrote about David. The entries from when David was a teenager were filled with a disturbing mix of pride and fear. My father expressed how much he loved David, how much he wanted him to succeed, but also his growing concern about David's own ruthlessness, a quality my father had instilled in him, but one that now terrified him. He saw echoes of his own darker self in David, and it scared him. He wrote about how David, even as a young man, had an uncanny ability to exploit weaknesses, to manipulate situations to his advantage. There were hints of unethical practices David had engaged in, small at first, but escalating within the company, with my father turning a blind eye, hoping he would outgrow it. And then I found it, the entry that chilled me to the bone. Dated just a few years before his death, it described a specific, intricate scheme David had orchestrated to eliminate a business partner who was getting too close to uncovering my father's original fraud. It wasn't murder, not physical harm, but a calculated, brutal financial ruin, framed to look like a legitimate business failure. My father was horrified, truly aghast at how far David had gone, at the monster he had created. He wrote, "I built this empire on a lie, and now my son is building his own on a foundation of pure malice. I cannot allow this to continue. The legacy I leave behind must be clean, truly clean, even if it means tearing it all down." He detailed his plan, a secret investigation into David's recent activities, meticulously documented, paralleling his own earlier confessions. He wanted to expose David, not just to protect the company, but to protect David from himself, to force him to confront the dark path he was on. The silver key, I realized, was for a safe deposit box mentioned in the final entries, containing even more damning evidence, including recordings and signed affidavits. My father intended for all of this to be revealed after his death, a final, desperate attempt to right his wrongs and to save his son from a life of corruption. He left it to me, the dreamer, the one he thought was untainted by the business, to deliver the truth. The boat wasn't an insult, it was a messenger, a vessel carrying a devastating truth. I spent the next few days in a daze, rereading the journal, cross-referencing names and dates. The weight of what I held was immense. I had the power to expose my father's decades, old crimes, and, even more pressingly, to bring down David's entire burgeoning empire, built on a foundation of recent, equally illicit activities. I could ruin him utterly. The irony was almost unbearable. My father, the man who had dismissed me, had inadvertently given me the ultimate weapon. I couldn't confront David directly without solidifying my evidence. I used the silver key to access the safe deposit box. Inside, just as my father had written, were files, recordings, and legal documents that left no doubt. David had been actively involved in corporate espionage, insider trading, and even some ethically questionable land deals that bordered on outright fraud. My father's plan was clear. He wanted the truth to come out, slowly, methodically, to dismantle the corrupt edifice he had created, and David had continued. Armed with this evidence, I contacted Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer. He was initially dismissive, clearly still viewing me as the artistic one, not the serious one. But when I presented him with excerpts from the journal and the contents of the safe deposit box, his face went ashen. He recognized the implications immediately. He saw the potential for monumental scandal, not just for the Sterling Group, but for every individual involved, including himself if he were perceived as complicit. He advised me to proceed with extreme caution, but he also acknowledged the undeniable truth of the evidence. The confrontation with David was not a grand, dramatic reveal in a boardroom, but a quiet, tense meeting in Mr. Henderson's office. I had instructed the lawyer to lay out the evidence, piece by piece, as if it were a routine legal matter. David listened, his face slowly losing its characteristic smugness, replaced by a growing dread. When Mr. Henderson finally presented the journal, David's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear in them. He knew his father's handwriting, and he knew what those pages could contain. He tried to deny it, to dismiss it as fabrications, but the meticulous detail, the cross-referenced documents, the audio recordings, it was too much. His face crumbled, the polished facade cracking under the weight of his father's final judgment. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The Sterling Group, under Mr. Henderson's guidance, and with my quiet cooperation, initiated an internal investigation. It was framed publicly as a restructuring, an auditing process, to protect the company's image, but behind the scenes it was a purge. David was forced to resign, quietly, under the guise of personal reasons. His reputation was ruined, his career in shambles. He lost everything, not just the empire, but his standing, his prestige, the very identity he had so carefully cultivated. He tried to fight back, to threaten me, but I simply showed him more evidence, more details from the journal, and he quickly understood the futility of resistance. The sheer volume of my father's meticulous documentation was overwhelming. He knew he was caught. The company itself underwent a massive transformation. The illegal dealings were rectified, the stolen intellectual property returned, and those who had been wronged were compensated. It was a long, painful process, but it was necessary. I didn't take over the company. That was never my intention. I simply ensured that my father's final wish to clean the slate was fulfilled. I established a new foundation, funded by a portion of the company's assets, dedicated to ethical business practices and supporting young entrepreneurs. The rest of the company was eventually sold off in pieces, ensuring no one individual could wield the same corrupt power. David disappeared from public life. I heard he moved to a small town, living a quiet existence, a shadow of the man who once commanded a $41 million empire. I don't pity him, but I don't actively hate him anymore either. The bitterness has faded, replaced by a strange sense of closure. My father, in his own twisted way, had finally given me something truly valuable, not an empire, but the truth and the chance to finally, truly set things right. The old boat, the Seafarer, I kept it. I eventually restored it, painstakingly, piece by piece, bringing it back to life. It now sits proudly in the marina, a reminder not of an inheritance, but of a secret, a legacy, and the surprising power of a hidden truth. So that's the story of my brother, the boat, and my father's secret. It was a hell of a ride, one I never saw coming. It taught me a lot about family, about greed, and about the long-reaching consequences of our choices. I guess the moral of the story is that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't what you expect, and the biggest fortunes can come with the heaviest price. Like this video if you were on my side, if you think I did the right thing by exposing everything. Subscribe for more stories like this, where secrets unravel and justice, in its own way, is served. And share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section below. I'll see you all in the next story.